Across Europe, immigration rules are changing faster than ever before. European countries are now rewriting their immigration rules so fundamentally that the policies they are enforcing today would have been politically unthinkable when they were first proposed a decade ago. Deportation flights have restarted. Asylum applications have collapsed. Cash is being paid to people who agree to leave. And the most striking part of the whole story is who is doing it, not fringe governments or political outsiders, but sitting prime ministers, centrist coalitions, and social democrats who spent years arguing for exactly the opposite approach. Here is what is happening country by country. 1. Hungary. In September 2015, Viktor Orbán did something that the entire European political establishment told him was wrong. Hungary put up a fence along its border with Serbia. The EU filed legal proceedings against it. A €200 million fine was imposed for non-compliance. Leaders across the continent publicly condemned it. The international press called it extremism. Orbán was compared to the authoritarians of the 20th century. Nobody thought he was right. Then the numbers came in. Monthly illegal crossings fell from 30,000 to under 300. In just 4 months. By 2022, Hungary recorded 29 asylum applications for the entire calendar year. Not 29,000, just 29, for a country of nearly 10 million people. While other countries were spending billions every single year managing the consequences of its open-door policy, Hungary was spending almost nothing. The European Commission spent a decade trying to legally force Hungary to undo what it had done. One by one, the same countries that had filed complaints against Hungary began building their own fences, passing their own emergency asylum laws, and launching their own deportation programs. They did not announce that they were doing what Hungary had done. They simply did it. 2. Greece. The Greek islands sit a few kilometers off the Turkish coast. At the narrowest point, the crossing is short enough that on a clear day, you can see the other side. Between 2015 and 2019, more than 1 million people made that crossing. They came in such numbers and at such speed that the Greek state had no realistic capacity to process, house, or manage what was arriving. The island of Lesbos became the image of the crisis. The Moria camp, built on an old military base, had a designed capacity of around 3,000 people. At its peak, it held over 20,000. Families were living in tents between the olive trees outside the perimeter because there was no space inside. Sanitation failed. Violence inside the camp became a documented daily event. In September 2020, a fire tore through Moria and destroyed most of it. 13,000 people were left with nothing on a Greek island in the middle of the night. That fire did not start because Greece had failed. It started because Greece was absorbing a problem that was not of its making, with resources it did not have. By February 2020, residents of Lesbos were physically blocking riot police trying to expand the camps. What followed was a complete transformation of how Greece manages its border. A 5-meter steel wall now runs along 37 kilometers of the Evros River, the land border between Greece and Turkey in the northeast of the country. It is fitted with thermal cameras, motion detectors, and watchtowers. Construction on a further 27 kilometers began in early 2026. The Hellenic Coast Guard shifted from rescue operations to interception operations, turning boats back toward Turkish waters before they reached Greek territory. The government changed the legal framework so that any asylum applicant whose claim is rejected has 14 days to leave the country voluntarily. Day 15 triggers mandatory detention, a prison sentence of 2 to 5 years. Illegal crossing arrests in the Evros region dropped 26% in the first 7 months of 2025, compared to the same period in 2024. Total arrivals into Greece fell 21% in a single year. The island camps that once held 40,000 people now hold fewer than 2,000. 3. Denmark. Denmark's prime minister, Mette Frederiksen, said something in public that most European leaders would not say even in private. Her government's goal for asylum arrivals is 0. Not low, not manageable. 0. She put it in policy documents and has repeated it without apology every time she has been asked. Frederiksen is a social democrat. Her party built the Danish welfare state. She is the person who decided to close the door it built. Denmark watched what happened to Sweden, the same values, the same welfare system, and a per capita intake in 2015 that produced, within a decade, gang violence, residential grenade attacks, and suburbs the state could no longer govern. Denmark looked at Sweden and decided, not us. What followed was a three-part strategy, unlike anything else in Europe. First, asylum claims are now processed in third countries in Africa. If your claim is approved, you do not come to Denmark. You resettle in the processing country permanently. Denmark considers its obligation fulfilled without you ever arriving on Danish soil. Second, Denmark created a legal category called the parallel society, neighborhoods formally designated by the state where more than half the residents have non-Western backgrounds, and where welfare dependency and school performance cross defined thresholds. Inside these zones, criminal sentences are doubled by law. Between 2019 and 2023, over 11,000 housing units in these areas were demolished, nearly 5,000 residents displaced, specifically to break up concentrated enclaves. Third, Denmark ran advertising campaigns in source countries, in local languages, with a single message saying Denmark is not your destination. 4. Sweden. In 2015, Sweden accepted 163,000 asylum seekers, 1.6% of its entire population in a single year. No other country in Europe came close to that per capita figure. Sweden did not just open the door. It held the door open and welcomed everyone through it. A decade later, the country had one of the highest rates of gun crime in Europe. Police data showed hand grenade detonations rising from fewer than 5 per year in 2015 to 39 at peak. Gang violence concentrated in suburbs where most residents came from non-Western backgrounds, with homicide rates among young men in those areas running 3 times the national average. The reversal was dramatic. Sweden offered voluntary departure payments of up to $34,000 per adult who agreed to return home. Economists calculated it was cheaper than lifetime welfare costs. Teachers and doctors were legally required to report undocumented individuals. Welfare access for people without legal status was eliminated entirely. By 2024, Statistics Sweden recorded net negative migration among non-Western immigrant groups for the first time in 50 years. More people were leaving than arriving. 5. Germany. In 2015, Angela Merkel stood at a podium and said 3 words that defined the next decade of European politics. "Wir schaffen das." We can do this. Germany opened its doors, and over 1.2 million asylum seekers entered in a single year. Then came the attacks. Each attack came with the same political cycle. Shock, mourning, debate, promises of action. Then the next one. Friedrich Merz, the CDU leader who had been running on a hardline migration platform, said the limit had been reached. He was not speaking as a fringe politician. He was speaking as the man who was about to become chancellor. In February 2025, the CDU won the federal election. His first act in office was to formally revoke the instruction that Merkel had issued in 2015, the verbal directive that had allowed undocumented migrants to enter Germany and claim asylum on arrival. The policy that had defined Germany's identity for a decade was canceled by the same party that created it. What followed was a series of moves that would have been considered legally and politically impossible in Germany 5 years earlier. Permanent border control were reinstated across all 9 of Germany's land frontiers. The Schengen Agreement, the founding principle of European free movement that Germany had championed for 30 years, was effectively suspended at the Federal Republic's own request. Asylum applications dropped more than 50% year-on-year. Charter deportation flights suspended for years resumed. The Interior Ministry launched what German media called the deportation turbo, a fast-track removal system that processed cases in weeks rather than the years that the old system had routinely taken. 6. France. France deported 22,000 people in 2024, a 27% increase from the previous year, and the highest single-year deportation figure in its modern history. The deeper shift was legal and historic. France moved to restrict birthright citizenship in its overseas territory of Mayotte, a small island in the Indian Ocean that had become the entry point for one of the highest per capita irregular migration flows in French territory, with arrivals from the Comoros archipelago arriving specifically to give birth on French soil and secure automatic citizenship for their children. The policy was challenged immediately. France's highest constitutional court upheld it in 2025. The principle of jus soli, automatic citizenship for anyone born on French soil, was no longer absolute. What made this politically possible was the public. Polling showed nearly 80% of French respondents supported stricter immigration enforcement, including substantial numbers from immigrant communities themselves. The politics of immigration in France had stopped being a left-right argument. It had become a question of whether the French state was willing to function. 7. Austria. Austria sits at a geographical crossroads that makes migration impossible to ignore. For Austrian border towns, the pressure of irregular migration is a daily operational reality that their police, their local authorities, and their communities have been managing for years. In September 2024, Austrian voters made the Freedom Party the largest party in the country. It was the first time a party of the far right had won a national election in Austria since the Second World War. The reaction in Brussels and across European capitals was immediate and visible. The other Austrian parties did what establishment coalitions tend to do when they lose to someone they find unacceptable. They tried to govern without him. The Conservatives attempted to build a majority coalition that excluded the Freedom Party entirely. The negotiations dragged on for months, produced nothing stable, and eventually collapsed under the weight of their own contradictions. 8. Netherlands. The Netherlands had built its national identity around tolerance and welcome for decades. In August 2022, that identity collided with a registration center designed for a few hundred people holding over 700, with hundreds more sleeping outside for weeks. A 3-month-old infant died at the site. Doctors Without Borders, an organization that normally operates in active war zones, opened an emergency project in one of the wealthiest founding members of the European Union. In November 2023, Geert Wilders won the Dutch election. The government that followed passed the Asylum Emergency Measures Act, the strictest immigration law in modern Dutch history. Permanent residence permits were abolished. Family reunification was restricted to spouses and minor children. Forced deportation became standard. When that coalition collapsed and a younger centrist took over in 2026, his government kept the same hard line. The center had moved. The replacement was stricter than what used to be called the far right 3 years earlier. 9. Italy. In September 2023, the island of Lampedusa processed more than 7,000 arrivals in a single 24-hour window. More people arrived in one day than lived on the entire island. Italy's response, under Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni, was to move the processing system itself out of Italy entirely. The Albania Protocol established 2 Italian-run processing centers on Albanian soil. Migrants intercepted at sea were taken to Albania, processed under Italian law by Italian staff, and deported from Albania if rejected, never reaching Italian territory. Courts challenged it repeatedly. Meloni did not move once. The practical results came from bilateral deals. 800 million euros paid to Tunisia and Libya for departure prevention. Sea arrivals fell 60% in 1 year. Italy did not just close its border, it pushed its border hundreds of kilometers south and paid for the privilege. 10. Poland. Poland's border situation is different from every other country on this list. What Warsaw faced was not a migration challenge in the conventional sense. It was a deliberate weapons-grade operation. Starting in mid-2021, the Belarusian regime of Alexander Lukashenko, working in coordination with Russian intelligence services according to European security assessments, began flying migrants from Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan into Minsk and moving them toward the Polish frontier. Belarusian border guards handed migrants wire cutters. The objective was explicit: overwhelm the European asylum system, destabilize Poland, and fracture EU unity. Poland's response was a 186-kilometer steel barrier with 400 cameras, radar, seismic sensors, and autonomous drones, completed in 9 months. In March 2025, Prime Minister Donald Tusk, a centrist, signed into law a suspension of asylum rights at the Belarusian border. Migrants intercepted in the buffer zone are turned around within hours. No hearing, no appeal. The European Commission called it potentially unlawful. Tusk has not changed a single provision. 11. Finland. Finland shares a 1,300-kilometer land border with Russia, the longest EU-Russia land border of any member state. In late 2023, Helsinki accused Moscow of deliberately channeling migrants toward Finnish border crossings in a coordinated operation, mirroring exactly what Belarus had done to Poland. Finland's response was immediate. It closed all border crossings with Russia and kept them closed. Under Prime Minister Petteri Orpo's coalition, which includes the Finns Party, Finland passed immigration legislation in 2024 that placed it among the strictest in the Nordic region. Asylum seeker financial allowances were cut. Family reunification rules were tightened to some of the most restrictive in the EU. Finland, which had previously been one of the quieter Nordic countries on this issue, moved quickly and decisively. The legislation has been studied by Denmark and Sweden as a model for the next phase of Nordic immigration policy reform. The country that once barely appeared in European immigration debates had become one of its most watched case studies. Different countries, one direction. What is striking is not that these things happened, it is who made it happen. A social democrat in Denmark, a centrist in Poland, the same party in Germany that opened the borders in 2015. Sweden's welfare state architects. These are not outsiders who took power from the political mainstream, reading the data that their own governments collected and drawing conclusions that a decade ago they were publicly opposed to. Whether this represents a correction or an overcorrection is the question that will define European politics for the next generation. The rest of the world is watching to see what comes next.